The man on the dock in Cork does not look at the sea. He looks at the ship. It is riding low in the water, heavy, its hold packed with grain and salted beef and butter, and it is sailing away from him, away from Ireland, out toward England. While behind him, his own children lie in a one-room cabin, too weak to stand. It is the autumn of 1847, and he has just watched more food than his village will see in a year float calmly out of a starving country. He does not shout. He has learned that shouting changes nothing. He simply stands there, a living man, watching the food that could save his family leave under armed guard. And he tries to understand how a nation surrounded by fields and harbors and cattle can be eating grass. The answer is in his hand. It is small and lumpy and rotten. It fits in a single palm, and it is black at the center, and it smells of decay. And this ugly, ruined little thing is the reason a green and fertile island is dying. One crop. One failure. And you have to understand before this is over, that same object, the humble potato you probably ate this week without a second thought, will be tied to genocide, to slavery, to kings and emperors and the moon. But the story of the potato does not begin on that dock. It does not begin in Ireland at all. To understand how a vegetable buried a nation, you have to travel thousands of years back and half a world away, up to a place where the air is so thin it burns your lungs, to a mountainside 12,000 feet above the sea. High in the Andes, in what is now Peru and Bolivia, the ground does something cruel. During the day, the sun is fierce enough to blister skin. At night, the temperature crashes below freezing. Almost nothing that feeds a human being can survive that swing. Corn will not grow that high. Wheat is a fantasy. And yet, somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 years ago, the people living on those slopes found something growing in the poisoned soil that no sane creature should have eaten. A wild tuber, knotted and small, laced with enough natural toxin to make a grown man violently ill. In its raw, wild state, the potato is not food. It is a warning. And here's the first miracle of this story, the part almost nobody tells you. Those Andean farmers did not have laboratories. They did not have chemistry. They had observation and patience and thousands of years. And they used all three to do something that should have been impossible. They watched which plants poisoned them less. They bred them, generation after generation, selecting and crossing and selecting again, until they had pulled a food crop out of a poison. And they didn't stop at one. They created not a potato, but potatoes, thousands of them. Purple ones, red ones shaped like fingers, ones that grow only in one specific valley and nowhere else on Earth. To this day, the Andes hold something like 4,000 distinct varieties, a living library of a crop the rest of the world reduced to a handful of types. They didn't have the word for genetics. They didn't have the word for biodiversity. But standing barefoot on a freezing mountainside, they were doing it anyway, and doing it better than we do now. And then they did something even stranger. The high Andes freeze almost every night, and the people learned to weaponize that cold. They would spread their potatoes out on the ground in the frigid dark, let the frost pierce them, and then in the morning, whole families, men, women, children, would walk out onto the field and stamp on them with their bare feet, crushing the water out. Freeze at night, trample by day, dry in the sun, repeat. What they made was called chuño, a shrunken, rock-hard nugget of pure potato that would keep, without rotting, without refrigeration, for 10 years, sometimes longer. Think about that for a second. 1,000 years before your freezer, before canning, before any of it, people standing on the roof of the world had invented freeze-dried food by stomping on frozen tubers in their bare feet. That is not a primitive act. That is engineering. And it is the reason the empires of the Andes could feed armies, store against famine, and rule a mountain range. The genius was in the ground the whole time, and the people who cracked it get almost no credit for it. That is their story. It belongs to them. Now hold that image, that stored mountain of preserved potato, because it is about to fuel something monstrous. When the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, they were hunting for gold and silver. And in the mountains of Bolivia, they found a peak so rich in silver it barely seemed real. They called it Potosí, and they drove the native population into that mountain to dig, in conditions that killed men by the hundreds of thousands over the following centuries. The mines needed workers, and the workers needed to eat. And up at that altitude, in that cold, only one food could keep them on their feet. Chuño, the potato. The very crop the Andean people had spent millennia perfecting to survive their mountains was now being used to keep them alive just long enough to die inside one. So the first thing the potato ever did on the world stage was not feed the poor of Europe. It fed the silver mines that flooded Europe with money that funded wars and cathedrals and kings. All of it dug out by dying hands kept working on a diet of freeze-dried tubers. The greedy men who sailed there looking for treasure were standing on top of the real one and never knew it. They shipped the silver home and thought that was the prize. The prize was the lumpy little root they'd have laughed at. Because when that root finally reached Europe, Europe recoiled from it. You would think a starving, war-torn, famine-prone continent would fall on its knees at a crop that grows in bad soil, survives cold, produces more calories per acre than grain, and doesn't need to be milled into bread. You would be wrong. Europe looked at the potato and saw the devil. The problems were, in their minds, obvious. The potato is not mentioned in the Bible. How could a good and Christian food have been left out of Scripture? It grows underground, in the dark, like something hiding, and things that grow in the dark were suspect. It belonged, botanically, to the nightshade family, and everyone knew nightshades were poison. And it was ugly. It was knotted and misshapen, and to the medical minds of the day it looked disturbingly like the swollen, deformed limbs of people suffering from leprosy. So they decided, and I want you to hear how insane this is, they decided the potato caused leprosy. Eat the lumpy thing, become the lumpy thing. In 1748, the French Parliament took this seriously enough to formally forbid the cultivation of the potato, on the grounds that it was a threat to human health. An entire government, in the age of the Enlightenment, banned a vegetable for causing a disease it has nothing to do with. In parts of Europe, the potato was considered fit only for pigs, for prisoners, for the desperate. Respectable people would not touch it. It was peasant food, and worse than peasant food. It was foreign, ugly, unholy peasant food that the church eyed with suspicion, and the wealthy wouldn't allow at their tables. And this is the part that always kills me. A continent that would, within a lifetime, be so dependent on this crop that its failure could empty a country, first spent decades insisting the thing was cursed. The salvation was sitting in the dirt, and Europe was too proud and too superstitious to dig it up. It would take a lunatic to change that. Thankfully, history provided one. His name was Antoine Augustin Parmentier, and he was, by any reasonable measure, obsessed. Parmentier was a French army pharmacist, and during the 7 Years' War, he was captured by the Prussians and thrown in prison, where his captors fed him, as a form of contempt because it was considered animal feed, almost nothing but potatoes. Parmentier expected to sicken. Instead, he thrived. He walked out of that prison healthier than he went in, and he walked out with a mission that would consume the rest of his life. He was going to make France love the potato, and he did not much care what it took. He wrote papers. He won a scientific prize for it. But papers don't change what frightened people put in their mouths, and Parmentier knew it, so he turned to spectacle. He threw lavish dinners where every single course, from soup to dessert, was secretly made of potato, and he invited the most famous men in France to eat them. Benjamin Franklin sat at one of those tables. He presented the king and queen with bouquets of potato flowers. The queen, reportedly, wore the blossoms in her hair, and suddenly the ugly peasant weed was a fashion statement at the Palace of Versailles. But his masterstroke, the thing that makes Parmentier immortal, was pure psychological warfare. The king granted him a plot of poor land outside Paris to grow his potatoes. Parmentier planted the field, and then he did something no farmer had ever done. He posted armed guards around it, soldiers, standing watch, over a field of potatoes. Day after day, the local peasants watched heavily armed men guarding this crop as though it were treasure, and they drew the obvious conclusion: if it's worth guarding like that, it must be worth stealing. And here is the genius, the part that should make you smile. Parmentier told the guards to accept bribes, and at night, to go home. He left the field unwatched on purpose. The peasants crept in, stole his potatoes, planted them in their own gardens, and did exactly what he wanted. He didn't convince France to grow the potato. He tricked France into stealing it. And a stolen thing, unlike a gift, feels valuable. He was not alone in his obsession. Far to the east, Frederick the Great of Prussia had reached the same conclusion by a blunter road. Frederick understood that a crop this hardy could feed his subjects to the famines that regularly killed them, and when his people refused to plant it, he did not persuade, he ordered. His so-called potato decree commanded villages to grow the crop, and legend says that when peasants still resisted, he stationed soldiers to guard royal potato fields precisely so the locals would assume they were precious and steal the seed. 2 rulers, 2 guarded fields, the same beautiful trick. Nothing makes a human being want a thing like being told it isn't for them. Slowly, it worked. The potato crept out of the gardens of the desperate and into the fields of everyone. And here the story turns, because the potato did not just feed Europe, it transformed it. This one crop produced so many more calories from the same patch of ground than wheat that historians now credit it with helping double Europe's population. More food meant more people. More people meant more workers and more soldiers, meant crowded growing cities, meant hands for the factories of the coming Industrial Revolution and bodies for the armies of kings. The little tuber that couldn't get invited to dinner quietly became the fuel of the modern world. Nations rose on it. And one nation, more than any other, married itself to the potato completely. That marriage would become the most catastrophic love affair in the history of food. Ireland in the early 19th century was a country of tenants. Most of the land was owned by a small class of often absentee landlords, and the great mass of the Irish poor rented tiny plots on which they had to grow everything a family needed to survive. And the potato, for a poor Irish family, was a gift from the ground. On a single acre, a plot barely bigger than a modern city lot, a family could grow enough potatoes to feed themselves for a year. It grew in the wet, cool Irish soil where little else thrived. It gave them calories, and crucially, with a bit of milk, it gave them nearly complete nutrition. Irish laborers were, by the accounts of the time, tall and strong and healthy, and many of them ate almost nothing but potatoes, pounds and pounds of them every single day. But there was a flaw in the gift, and it was a fatal one. To get the most food from the least land, Irish farmers had narrowed their crop down to a single dominant variety, a high-yielding potato called the lumper. Remember those 4,000 varieties in the Andes, that living library of genetic difference? Ireland had thrown almost all of it away. A whole nation was leaning its entire survival on one type of one crop, grown from tubers that were essentially clones of one another. Genetically, the fields of Ireland were nearly identical, endless and defenseless. They had, without knowing it, built a nation on a single point of failure. What could threaten one plant could threaten every plant. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. In 1845, something arrived on the wind and the water. A microscopic organism, a water mold we now call Phytophthora infestans, blew into Europe, most likely aboard ships from the Americas. It found in the packed, identical potato fields of Ireland the perfect victim. And what it did with horrifying speed. A farmer would walk his field in the evening and see it green and healthy and full of promise. He would wake the next morning to a smell. Not a growing smell, a rotting one. The leaves had gone black. Within days, the entire field was a slick, stinking, liquefying mass of putrefaction, the plants collapsing into black slime. And when he dug frantically into the earth for the potatoes themselves, hoping to save something, they came up soft and gray and foul, rotting in his hands. The food was gone. Not damaged, gone. dissolved into the ground it grew in. And it happened field after field, county after county, faster than anyone could comprehend. Picture one family, a woman in a stone cabin with a dirt floor, her children beside her, the field outside black and dead. The food she counted on for the entire year is gone, and there is no money, because every scrap she grew that wasn't a potato went to pay the rent. She waits and hopes the next year is better. The blight comes back the next year, and the year after that. She watches her children's faces change, watches them grow thin, then hollow, then still. And she is not one woman. She is hundreds of thousands of women in hundreds of thousands of cabins all across a green and beautiful island, and the world's most powerful empire is watching it happen. This is the part that should make you angry. Because the blight was a natural disaster, the famine was not. Here is the fact that turns tragedy into crime. Throughout the worst years of the starvation, Ireland was exporting food. That man on the Cork dock was not imagining those ships. Grain, cattle, butter, pigs, food that could have kept people alive was leaving Irish ports under armed guard, sailing to England, sold for profit, while the people who lived beside those harbors ate weeds and died in ditches. Ireland did not run out of food. Ireland ran out of the one food its poor were allowed to keep for themselves, while the rest sailed away. And why? Why let a nation starve on top of its own exports? Because the men in charge of the response believed, with something close to religious conviction, that it would be wrong to intervene too much. And no man embodied that belief more coldly than Charles Trevelyan, the British Treasury official who held the relief effort in his hands. Trevelyan was a true believer in the economics of leaving things alone. He worried, openly, in writing, that feeding the Irish too generously would make them dependent, would corrupt their character, would interfere with the natural workings of the market. He restricted relief. He shut down food programs he thought too soft, and he wrote his reasoning down in official correspondence, not in some private diary he never expected read. He described the famine as an instrument, calling it, in effect, a judgment sent by Providence to teach the Irish people a lesson. He wrote that the real evil to be confronted was not the physical hunger, but what he called the moral character of the people themselves. He put those words on paper as a matter of policy. Sit with that for a moment. 1 million people are dying, and the man holding the food is writing that the true problem is their character. The blight was nature. It came on the wind, and no one could have stopped it. But the ships sailing out of a starving country, the relief withheld, the belief that hunger was a moral corrective, that was not nature. That was a choice. That was policy. And it was made by men who then went home to full tables. By the time the blight finally released its grip, around 1 million people were dead of starvation and the diseases that hunt the starving. 1 million. 1 million. And another million, perhaps more, fled. Packed into overcrowded ships, sailing for America and Britain and Australia, many dying on the voyage in vessels so deadly they earned a name: coffin ships. In the space of a few years, Ireland lost roughly 1/4 of its population. 1/4. Gone, to the grave or across the sea. There are more people of Irish descent scattered across the world today than there are people in Ireland, and the reason for that scattering is a rotten potato and a cold decision. That is Ireland's story, and it belongs to Ireland, a wound carried in families for generations, in the songs, in the names on gravestones in Boston and New York and Melbourne. No one else gets to own it. And the thing that caused it? It's still out there. But before we get to that, let me show you what that same little tuber became once the horror passed, because the potato did not vanish into infamy. It quietly conquered the entire planet. Today, the potato is the 4th most important food crop on Earth, behind only corn, wheat, and rice. The world grows something on the order of 370 million metric tons of it every single year. It is eaten on every inhabited continent, in nearly every country, by billions of people, most of whom have no idea it was ever feared, ever banned, ever blamed for the death of a nation. The average American alone eats well over 100 pounds of potato a year, And most of that isn't the boiled potato of the Irish cabin, it's fried. Think about the last time you drove through anywhere and ordered French fries. There is a genuinely staggering industrial machine behind that little paper carton. One company alone processing potatoes by the millions of tons, and it traces in an unbroken line back to a poison tuber on a freezing Andean slope. But the potato didn't stop at conquering the planet. It left it. In 1995, aboard a NASA space shuttle, potato plants were grown in orbit, among the first food crops ever cultivated in space. The logic is beautiful and grim all at once. If humanity is ever going to survive on the Moon or on Mars, we will need a crop that produces enormous nutrition in a tiny space under brutal conditions. And scientists keep arriving at the same answer the Andean farmers arrived at 10,000 years ago: the potato. The International Potato Center, working with NASA, has run experiments to see whether potatoes could grow in soil engineered to mimic the surface of Mars. The crop that survived a freezing mountaintop is now being asked to survive another planet, and the early results say it just might. The food of prisoners and pigs is on the short list of what could keep the first Martians alive. And here is one more, the one that should make the hair on your arm stand up. That water mold, Phytophthora infestans, the thing that liquefied Ireland's fields and helped kill 1 million people, it was never defeated. It is still here. It still attacks potato crops around the world every year, and it still costs farmers billions of dollars annually in ruined harvests and the chemicals needed to hold it back. It has evolved. New, more aggressive strains keep appearing. The exact kind of thing that starved Ireland is out there right now, in fields on every continent, kept at bay by nothing more than constant vigilance and modern fungicide. And because so much of the world still grows a narrow range of potato varieties, that old vulnerability, a whole crop that's genetically too similar to defend itself, has never fully gone away. The lesson of the lumper is one we are still, quietly, at risk of failing. Which brings us back, at the end of all this, to a man standing on a dock in Cork. Think about him again now, holding that single rotten potato in his hand, watching the ships take the food away. Understand what he was actually holding. He was holding a thing pulled from poison by mountain farmers over 10,000 years. A thing that fed the silver mines that funded empires. A thing that priests called unholy and doctors called a plague, and a French parliament outlawed. A thing that a lunatic pharmacist guarded with fake soldiers so his neighbors would steal it, and a king ordered his subjects to plant. A thing that doubled the population of a continent and helped power the modern world. And then, because a nation leaned its whole life on a single fragile version of it, dissolved into black slime and helped erase 1/4 of that nation from the earth. A thing that now grows in orbit, that we are trying to teach to survive on Mars. All of that in one lumpy little root, small enough to hold in one palm, powerful enough to decide who ruled and who starved. So the next time you're standing in your kitchen and you reach for a potato, the most ordinary thing in the world, the thing you'd never think about twice, I want you to feel the weight of it for just a second, because you will never look at a potato the same way again. Now I want to hear from you, and I want you to pick. Drop a comment and tell me which one got under your skin the most. The ships full of food sailing away from a starving Ireland while people ate grass on the shore? Trevelyan writing on official paper that the famine was a lesson the Irish needed to learn? Or the fact that the exact organism that liquefied those fields is still out there, right now, in crops on every continent, waiting? One horror, one cold-blooded choice, one thing that never actually ended. Tell me which one you can't stop thinking about, and I'll see you in the next one.